I looked at my hands, and they weren't mine anymore. The skin was cracking into dry, brittle canvas, and my veins were turning into thick, black oil paint. On the motel wall, the painting of the lonely road was no longer just art, it was a cage. My friends were already inside, their faces twisted in a silent, painted scream. We didn't just check into this motel. We became the artist's next exhibit. And he's standing right outside the door. Tires of the old sedan hulled against the overheated asphalt, producing a monotonous groan that mimicked the sound of a weary, dying beast. Thomas felt this vibration travel up through the steering column and into his wrists, anchoring itself behind his eyes until his skull thrummed with the mechanical rhythm. Outside, the rhythmic click-clack of the wipers acted as a metronome for the descent of night, smearing droplets of thick, oily evening mist across the windshield. The road ahead was a grey tongue swallowed by the horizon, offering no sign of their destination, only the repetitive blur of skeletal trees passing in the gloom. Through the haze, a flickering neon beacon bled into the dusk, announcing the wanderer's rest in a series of dying pink pulses. The sign emitted a frantic, high-pitched electric crackle, sounding like 1,000 frantic insects burning alive inside their glass tubes. As the car slowed and crunched onto the bed of loose, gray gravel, the sudden death of the engine felt like a physical blow to the ears. Sarah and Liam sat motionless for a moment in the sudden vacuum of sound, the stillness of the surrounding woods pressing against the metal frame of the vehicle like a heavy, suffocating weight. Stepping out into the air, the group encountered a silence so profound it seemed to have a physical texture, settling over their skin like a fine layer of soot. The motel office was a relic of weathered wood and peeling paint, where the air tasted of ancient dust and stagnant humidity. Thomas took the heavy iron key from the silent attendant, its cold, notched surface biting into his palm as they made their way toward their assigned door. The hinges groaned with a shrill, metallic protest, revealing an interior that smelled of damp timber, rancid grease, and the sickly sweet rot of water left too long in a vase of dead flowers. Inside, a single low-wattage bulb dangled from the ceiling on a frayed cord, casting long, shivering shadows that danced in the corners of the room. The wallpaper was a jaundiced yellow, peeling away in long, dry strips that curled like the skin of some gargantuan, molting reptile. Liam dropped his heavy duffel bag onto the thin carpet, releasing a visible puff of gray dust that hung suspended in the stagnant air. Sarah rubbed her arms against a sudden, unexplainable chill, her eyes darting toward the narrow window where the outside darkness seemed to be pressing its face against the glass. Hanging directly above the headboard of the sagging bed was a massive wooden frame, its dark timber carved into jagged, ornate patterns that resembled interlocking thorns. It housed a painting rendered in thick, aggressive strokes of oil that appeared almost wet in the flickering light of the room. The scene depicted a stretch of road so black it seemed to have been cut out of the fabric of the world, leading into an absolute, nihilistic void. A solitary street lamp stood on the shoulder, casting a pool of sickly yellow light that failed to illuminate anything beyond its immediate, narrow radius. Thomas found himself drawn to the canvas, noticing how the heavy brushwork created a physical topography of ridges and valleys on the surface. The blackness of the road was not merely a color but a depth, a light-consuming pit that made the rest of the dim room seem bright by comparison. The painted lamp glowed with a pale, jaundiced intensity, its light bleeding onto a patch of gravel that looked unnervingly realistic under the thick glaze. There was a deliberate, haunting emptiness to the composition, a silence captured in paint that mirrored the oppressive stillness of the motel itself. The shadows in the room seemed to lean toward the painting, drawn in by the gravitational pull of that illustrated void. Thomas reached out to touch the frame, feeling the grit of decades-old dust beneath his fingertips and a strange, vibrating coldness emanating from the wood. Outside, the last ticking sounds of the car's cooling engine died away, leaving them completely isolated in the heart of a vast, unmapped dark. He finally turned away from the canvas, but the image of that lonely lamp remained burned into his retinas, a tiny yellow spark drowning in a sea of encroaching, ink-black oil. The gray, listless light of the second morning did not so much break through the window as it seeped through the grime-streaked glass, manifesting as a sickly pallor that clung to the edges of the room. Thomas lay motionless on the stiff mattress, his eyes tracing the intricate map of water stains that blossomed across the ceiling like necrotic flowers. The air inside the cabin had grown even heavier overnight, thick with the scent of damp wool and the metallic tang of old plumbing. He felt a profound sense of lethargy pinning his limbs to the bed, a physical weight that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards beneath him. Every breath felt like a labor, pulling the stagnant, chilled air deep into lungs that felt as though they were slowly filling with fine, invisible silt. From the direction of the small, cramped bathroom came a sound that had been burrowing into his subconscious long before he had fully awakened. It was the rhythmic, relentless drip of a leaky faucet, each bead of water striking the rusted tin bottom of the basin with a sharp, echoing ring. In the absolute silence of the motel, the sound was magnified until it felt like a silver needle being driven into his ear canal at precise, agonizing intervals. It was a metronome for a dying world, a countdown that seemed to be measuring out the remaining seconds of his own life in cold, liquid increments. He watched a single bead of moisture swell at the tip of the faucet in his mind's eye, hanging for an eternity before surrendering to gravity and joining the stagnant pool below. Thomas finally forced himself to sit up, the springs of the bed shrieking with a dry, metallic protest that sounded like a scream cut short. His skin felt tacky and cold, a fine sheen of perspiration covering his forehead despite the low temperature of the room. He swung his feet onto the carpet, the thin, threadbare fibers feeling like coarse sand against his soles, and stood with a precarious balance. The room seemed to tilt slightly to one side, a subtle distortion of perspective that made his stomach churn with a sudden, sharp wave of vertigo. He steadied himself against the rough wood of the nightstand, his fingers brushing against a layer of dust so thick it felt like velvet under his touch. The heavy wooden frame above the bed drew his gaze with a magnetic, unavoidable force, its dark presence dominating the wall like an open wound. The painting remained angled slightly to the left, a crooked window into a world of absolute, unyielding shadow where the black road stretched toward a horizon that did not exist. Thomas stepped closer, his heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against his ribs that mirrored the rhythm of the dripping faucet in the bathroom. The dim morning light caught the ridges of the oil paint, highlighting the aggressive, chaotic texture of the brushwork. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering inches from the canvas as he sensed a faint, vibrating coldness emanating from the depicted darkness. His vision focused on the pool of yellow light beneath the solitary street lamp on the canvas, and the air seemed to vanish from his lungs in a single, silent gasp. There, nestled within the sickly glow on the shoulder of the black road, was a tiny, meticulously rendered silver shape that had not been there the night before. It was a car, a perfect, miniature replica of their own aging sedan, down to the slight dent in the rear bumper and the dull sheen of the weathered paint. The detail was impossible, a microscopic masterpiece of cruelty that seemed to have grown out of the canvas like a cyst. He leaned in until the scent of oxidized linseed oil and something more pungent, like sun-scorched rubber, filled his nostrils. With a hesitant, jerky motion, Thomas pressed the pad of his index finger against the silver speck, expecting to feel the tacky moisture of fresh paint. Instead, his skin met a surface that was bone-dry, hard, and brittle, textured with the fine, web-like cracks of extreme age. The silver paint was inseparable from the black void beneath it, integrated into the very fabric of the old canvas as if it had been painted 50 years ago. There were no new brushstrokes, no overlapping layers of recent work, only a seamless, ancient composition that now undeniably included their vehicle. The tactile sensation of the dry, jagged paint sent a jolt of ice through his nerves, causing his hand to recoil as if he had touched a freezing corpse. Behind him, the sounds of the room began to shift as Sarah and Liam stirred from their own uneasy slumbers, but their movements felt distant and disconnected. Sarah began to zip up her travel bag, the sound of the plastic teeth interlocking creating a harsh, grating rasp that set Thomas's teeth on edge. Liam moved toward the sink, his heavy footsteps thudding dully against the floorboards with a leaden, mechanical weight. Thomas turned to them, his voice caught in a throat that felt as though it were lined with dry wool, gesturing frantically toward the wall. He pointed at the silver car on the road, his finger shaking so violently it cast a flickering shadow across the frame, but his companions did not even pause in their mundane preparations. Sarah glanced at the painting for a fleeting second, her eyes glassed over with a strange, vacant apathy that made her appear like a stranger to him. She muttered something about the light playing tricks on his eyes, her voice sounding flat and hollow, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a deep, lightless well. Liam continued to splash cold water onto his face, the sound of the liquid hitting the porcelain basin echoing with a wet, slapping cadence that drowned out Thomas's attempts to speak. They seemed insulated from the horror, wrapped in a thick shroud of indifference that was more terrifying than the painting itself. They moved through the room like ghosts, their actions repetitive and devoid of any real purpose or urgency. The silence from the world outside the motel room was now so total that it felt like a physical pressure against the eardrums, a vacuum that had sucked away the very possibility of sound. There were no songs of morning birds, no rustle of wine through the dry grass, and no distant hum of traffic from the highway they had traveled the night before. The universe seemed to have truncated itself at the property line of the Wanderer's Rest, leaving them in a pocket of stagnant time and space. Thomas stood in the center of the room, his senses straining against the quiet, until he heard a new sound emerging from behind the thin, yellowed wallpaper of the northern wall. It was a low, rhythmic shuffling, a sound of immense effort and sluggish movement that seemed to vibrate through the very studs of the building. It sounded as though something heavy and shapeless was being dragged across a floor made of rough, unpolished stone, a slow sliding motion that paused and then resumed with agonizing deliberation. The quality of the sound was wet and fibrous, reminiscent of a large burlap sack filled with waterlogged rags being hauled by an unseen laborer. Thomas froze, his breath hitching in his chest, as he tracked the sound moving slowly from one end of the wall to the other. It was not coming from the next room, but seemed to be occurring within the very hollows of the structure itself. He pressed his palm against the wallpaper, feeling a faint, rhythmic thrumming that coincided with the dragging sound, a heartbeat of the building that felt cold and alien. The texture of the wall felt strangely soft under his hand, almost yielding, as if the plaster had turned to the consistency of cooling wax. The shuffling sound stopped abruptly directly in front of his hand, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like it might collapse the ceiling. He stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the floral pattern of the wallpaper, half expecting to see the outline of a hand or a face push through the thin material from the other side. Nothing moved, but the smell of stagnant water and old, wet earth intensified until it was nearly suffocating. Driven by a sudden, desperate need to verify the reality of the world outside, Thomas lunged toward the window and gripped the edges of the heavy, dust-caked curtains. The fabric felt greasy and limp in his hands, releasing a cloud of gray motes that danced in the pale light as he wrenched the drapes aside. The metal rings screeched along the rod, a sound like grinding teeth that made him wince, but he did not look away. He stared out at the parking lot, his eyes wide and burning, seeking some sign of life or normalcy in the gray expanse of the morning. The gravel was a sea of uniform, ashen stones, and the mist hung in stationary ribbons just above the ground, refusing to dissipate. The silver sedan sat alone in the center of the lot, its metallic skin reflecting the dull, sunless sky in a way that made it look like a carved hunk of lead. It was positioned at a precise angle, the nose of the car pointing toward the exit of the motel, exactly mirroring the orientation of the miniature vehicle on the canvas behind him. There was no one else on the grounds, no other cars, and no sign of the hunched owner who had checked them in the night before. The car looked abandoned, a relic of a journey that had already been forgotten, its tires slightly sunken into the loose gravel as if the earth were slowly attempting to claim it. The stillness of the vehicle was absolute, a frozen monument in a world that had ceased to breathe. Thomas looked from the car outside back to the painting on the wall, his head whipping back and forth as he tried to find a discrepancy, a single detail that did not align. The perspective was identical, the way the light of the painted lamp hit the painted car was a perfect shadow match for how the gray sky hit the real car. The realization began to settle in his gut like a cold, heavy stone, a sense of predestination that bypassed logic and spoke directly to his primitive fears. He felt as though he were looking at a map of a trap that had already been sprung, a blueprint for a nightmare that was being constructed around them in real time. The room felt smaller now, the walls inching inward by fractions of a millimeter with every beat of his heart. He let the curtain fall back into place, the heavy fabric swinging shut with a dull, final thud that plunged the area near the window back into a murky twilight. The room was now a tomb of their own making, filled with the sounds of his friend's mechanical movements and the never-ending drip of the faucet in the bathroom. Thomas slumped against the wall, his back sliding down the rough, peeling paper until he was sitting on the floor, his knees pulled tight against his chest. He closed his eyes, but the image of the black road and the silver car remained etched into the back of his eyelids in vivid, glowing detail. The shuffling sound behind the wall began again, slower this time, a deliberate and patient movement that suggested whatever was there was in no hurry to reach its destination. The third morning arrived not with the gentle intrusion of light, but with a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. Thomas lay paralyzed in the gray half-light, his head throbbing with a high-pitched, crystalline ringing that seemed to vibrate within the very marrow of his bones. It was the sound of a vacuum, a hollow roar of nothingness that made the world feel as though it had been emptied of all air and replaced with a thick, invisible fluid. His ears ached from the strain of seeking a single familiar noise, a bird, a distant engine, even the rustle of the sheets. The stillness was impenetrable, a wall of silence that bordered on the deafening. The ticking of his own internal clock seemed to have slowed, matching the sluggish, heavy flow of blood through his temples. Beneath the suffocating quiet, a new and discordant sensation began to claw at his senses, pulling him further from the mercy of sleep. A sharp, acrid scent began to permeate the room, cutting through the familiar odors of damp wood and ancient dust with the violence of a blade. It was the pungent, chemical stench of burnt rubber, thick and oily, as if a tire had been melted down in the center of the room. The smell was so concentrated that it left a bitter, scorched taste at the back of his throat, making every inhalation a struggle against the urge to gag. Despite the oppressive, searing nature of the smell, the air in the room remained deathly cold, a biting frost that turned his breath into a series of thin, ghostly plumes that vanished into the shadows. Thomas forced his stiffened muscles to move, his joints popping with a sound like dry twigs snapping in the frozen woods. He sat up slowly, feeling the icy air cling to his skin like a wet shroud, while his eyes were drawn inevitably toward the wall above the bed. The darkness of the room seemed to congregate around the heavy wooden frame, making the painting appear as a dark, pulsating hole in the reality of the cabin. In the gloom, the thick strokes of oil paint appeared to be in a state of slow, agonizing flux, the black road and the yellow pool of light undulating as if the canvas were breathing. The ridges of paint looked like worms beneath the skin of the world, shifting and reconfiguring themselves in a silent, grotesque dance. A sudden, violent tremor ran through his frame as he leaned closer, his vision narrowing until the painting filled his entire world. On the shoulder of the black road, positioned exactly where the silver sedan sat in the pool of jaundiced light, 3 new figures had emerged from the void of the canvas. They were not painted with the same sharp lines as the car, but appeared as tall, featureless silhouettes of deep, obsidian black that seemed to absorb the very light they stood within. They were shadows without bodies, dark stains upon the yellow glow of the lamp, yet their presence was more terrifying than any clearly defined monster. They stood in a tight cluster, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, staring out from the two-dimensional world directly into the room. Thomas felt a cold sweat break across his brow, the droplets freezing as they rolled down his temples toward his jawline. Even without the presence of faces, he recognized the figures with a primal, bone-deep certainty that bypassed all rational thought. The tallest silhouette stood with a slight, weary slouch that was identical to his own habitual posture when he was exhausted. Beside it, a smaller figure possessed the delicate, bird-like tilt of the head that Sarah always exhibited when she was deep in thought. The third, with its broad, blocky shoulders and aggressive stance, was undeniably Liam, captured in a moment of stillness that felt like a mockery of life. They were standing there, frozen in the amber of the painted light, waiting for something that had not yet arrived. The sound of his own breathing suddenly became the loudest thing in the universe, a harsh, rasping noise that sounded like rusted metal being dragged across a bed of coarse sandpaper. Every pull of air into his lungs felt like it was scraping away the lining of his throat, the sound echoing off the bare walls with a rhythmic, mechanical intensity. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was a desert of dry ash and burnt rubber, his tongue feeling like a heavy, swollen obstacle. He could hear the frantic, uneven thudding of his heart, a frantic drumming that seemed to be trying to beat its way out of his chest and into the silent room. The boundaries between his body and the oppressive atmosphere were beginning to blur, leaving him exposed to the encroaching darkness. Driven by a desperate, panicked need for movement, Thomas stumbled toward the door, his fingers fumbling with the cold, heavy iron of the latch. The metal bit into his skin with a freezing sting, but he wrenched the door open and lurched out into the narrow, dimly lit corridor of the motel. The walls of the hallway seemed closer than they had been the night before, the yellowed floral wallpaper appearing to bulge inward as if the building itself were holding its breath. The air here was even colder, smelling of stagnant water and the faint, sweet scent of rotting carnations. His footsteps on the worn carpet were silent, the floor absorbing the impact of his weight without a single creak, as if he were already losing his ability to affect the physical world. At the end of the corridor, near the entrance to the main office, the hunched figure of the motel owner materialized from the shadows like a stain appearing on a wall. He was draped in a shapeless, moth-eaten cardigan that hung from his skeletal frame in gray, dusty folds, his skin the color of old parchment. As Thomas approached, the old man did not look up, his gaze fixed on some unseen point on the floor, but a low, vibrating sound began to emanate from his throat. It was a laugh, but it lacked any shred of mirth or humanity, sounding instead like the dry shrishing of dead, brittle leaves being pushed through a rusted metal grate by a winter wind. The sound was thin and wheezing, rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence that made the hair on Thomas's neck stand on end. The owner's laughter died away into a series of wet, clicking coughs, and he finally raised his head to look at Thomas with eyes that were filmed over with a milky, opaque cataract. He spoke then, though his lips barely seemed to move, his voice sounding like the rubbing of two pieces of dry bone together. He dismissed Thomas's frantic, stuttered descriptions of the painting as mere coincidences, the ramblings of a tired mind playing tricks in the half-light of an unfamiliar room. He suggested that the shadows and the light were simply weaving patterns that the human brain, in its desperate need for order, misinterpreted as familiar shapes. Each word was a dry rasp that seemed to suck the remaining warmth from the air, leaving a trail of frost in the space between them. Without waiting for a response, the old man turned and shuffled toward a small, heavy door at the far end of the office, his movements slow and deliberate like those of a clockwork doll winding down. As the door swung open, a wave of thick, nauseating air rolled out into the hallway, hitting Thomas with the force of a physical blow. It was the scent of freshly turned, damp earth mixed with the sharp, clinical sting of formalin and the underlying musk of long-term decay. The smell was ancient and suffocating, the scent of a cellar that had been sealed for 100 years to hide something that refused to stay dead. It was the smell of the grave brought into the living world, a dark promise of the stillness that was to come. The owner slipped into the darkness of his room, the heavy wooden door swinging shut with a finality that sounded like a stone slab being dropped onto a tomb. The click of the lock was a sharp, metallic punctuation mark that echoed down the length of the narrow hallway, leaving Thomas alone once again in the thickening silence. He stood frozen in the center of the corridor, the flickering fluorescent light above him casting long, jerky shadows that seemed to reach out toward his feet. The silence returned with a vengeance, more profound than before, broken only by the distant, high-pitched whine that continued to scream inside his own skull. A sudden, paralyzing chill began to crawl up his spine, a trail of ice that started at the base of his tailbone and climbed slowly toward the nape of his neck. It was not the cold of the air, but an internal freezing, a realization that the heat was being sucked out of his soul by the very walls of the motel. His fingers began to twitch, and he looked down to see his hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists of their own accord. He could feel his fingernails digging deep into the soft flesh of his palms, the pain sharp and stinging, but it felt distant and secondary to the terror blooming in his gut. The sensation of his own blood trickling between his fingers was the only thing that felt real in a world that was rapidly turning into oil and shadow. He stood there for an eternity, his body locked in a state of primal flight or fight that had nowhere to go and nothing to strike. The narrow hallway seemed to stretch out, the door to his room appearing miles away at the end of a dark, tapering tunnel. He felt as though he were being observed by 1,000 invisible eyes peering through the patterns in the wallpaper, waiting for him to make a move so they could react in kind. Every inch of his skin was crawling, a sensation of thousands of tiny, phantom insects skittering across his limbs, yet when he looked down, there was nothing but his own pale, trembling flesh. Eventually, Thomas began to retreat toward his room, his back scraping against the rough texture of the wall as he refused to turn his eyes away from the owner's closed door. His movement was jerky and uncoordinated, his legs feeling like heavy columns of stone that he had to drag across the floor. The smell of burnt rubber followed him, clinging to his clothes and his hair, a persistent reminder of the black road that was waiting for him on the canvas. As he reached the threshold of his room, he felt a crushing sense of hopelessness, a realization that the door offered no protection from the reality that was being repainted around him. The silence of the motel was no longer just a lack of sound, it was a hungry, living thing that was slowly consuming his world, one heartbeat at a time. As the evening of the third day descended, the light did not so much fade as it was devoured by an encroaching, bruised purple shadow that bled from the corners of the ceiling. The air within the motel room became a stagnant pool of heavy, unmoving atoms, tasting of iron and the scorched, metallic scent of a dying heater. Outside, the silence that had characterized their stay was abruptly shattered by a new and rhythmic intrusion that seemed to originate from the very marrow of the earth. It was a low-frequency, mechanical hum, a vibration so deep that it bypassed the ears and settled directly into the soft tissues of the chest, making the internal organs shudder with a phantom chill. The sound waxed and waned with the precision of a massive, unseen lung, a drone of shifting gears and vibrating copper that felt like the heartbeat of a subterranean machine. Thomas stood frozen in the center of the room, his hands trembling with a fine, uncontrollable palsy as the hum intensified, vibrating the soles of his feet through the thin, greasy carpet. He looked toward Sarah and Liam, seeking some shred of shared alarm, but what he saw made the blood in his veins turn to slush. They were seated on the edges of their respective beds, their bodies locked in a state of profound, terrifying apathy that bordered on the catatonic. Their eyes were wide and glazed, reflecting the flickering overhead light with a dull, glass-like sheen, fixed upon a single, invisible point on the far wall. They did not blink, they did not breathe in a way that moved their shoulders, they simply existed as hollow vessels, their presence in the room feeling increasingly like an echo of something that had already departed. A sudden, sharp twitch galvanized Liam's right arm, the limb jerking upward in a series of stuttered, mechanical movements that reminded Thomas of a wooden marionette being operated by a novice puppeteer. The arm rose, the elbow locking with an audible, dry click, before the fingers began to curl and uncurl in a rhythmic, senseless pattern. Sarah's head tilted slowly to the side, her neck stretching with a sound like wet leather being pulled taut, until her ear nearly touched her shoulder. There was no pain in her expression, only a devastating blankness, a total erasure of the woman he had known. Their movements were not their own, they were the results of external impulses, erratic signals being sent to muscles that no longer belonged to the minds they once served. Thomas stumbled backward, his own breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that felt like he was inhaling shards of broken glass. He squeezed his eyes shut and pressed his palms against his temples, trying to force his mind to construct a bridge back to reality, a way to explain the madness with the cold tools of logic. He whispered silent arguments to himself, suggesting that the old, peeling paint on the walls was laced with hallucinogenic lead, or that the vents were pumping a colorless, odorless gas into the cramped space. He imagined a leak in some forgotten underground tank, a chemical soup that had seeped into their bloodstreams and was now playing a cruel symphony on their nervous systems. But even as he clung to these rationalizations, the smell of burnt rubber and ozone grew stronger, thick enough to coat his tongue in a layer of bitter, electric film. Driven by a morbid, magnetic pull, he opened his eyes and allowed his gaze to drift toward the heavy wooden frame above the bed, where the painting sat in its jagged, thorn-like cradle. The jaundiced light from the overhead bulb seemed to be sucked into the canvas, leaving the rest of the room in a sickly, pulsating twilight. On the black road, the three dark silhouettes had shifted again, their positions no longer static but seemingly caught in mid-motion. They were closer now, standing at the very edge of the painted pool of light, as if they were about to step out of the frame and into the physical world of the motel room. The depth of the black paint was no longer a flat color, it was a physical distance, a yawning chasm that promised to fall into a bottomless, silent void. Thomas leaned in, his face inches from the canvas, until the scent of ancient linseed oil and sun-damaged rubber became a suffocating cloud. His eyes widened as the microscopic details of the painting became clear, the thick ridges of oil resolving into textures that were impossible for a mere brush to achieve. He could see the individual weave of the fabric on the silhouette's clothing, the way the light caught the tiny, frayed threads of the denim and the coarse grain of the cotton. One of the figures wore a jacket with a distinctive, zigzag pattern in the stitching along the cuff, a detail that made Thomas's heart stop in its tracks. He looked down at his own sleeve, tracing the exact same zigzag pattern on his own jacket, the thread counts matching perfectly with the marks on the canvas. A wave of nausea crashed over him as he realized the painting was not a representation, but a mirror that was slowly absorbing their very essence. The figures on the road were wearing their lives, their memories, their very identities, rendered in a medium that refused to dry. The three shapes stood in a triangle of shadow, their lack of faces feeling like a personal affront, a void where his own features should have been. He felt a phantom sensation of being watched from behind, not by someone in the room, but by the figures in the painting looking through the back of his own head. The boundaries of his ego began to fray at the edges, his sense of self leaking out of his pores and onto the hungry surface of the black road. The physical space of the motel room began to react to his realization, the dimensions of the chamber warping in a slow, agonizing contraction. Thomas watched in silent horror as the walls seemed to inch inward, the jaundiced floral wallpaper buckling and creasing as if the building were being squeezed by a gargantuan, invisible hand. The corners of the room grew sharper, the shadows there thickening and extending like long, black fingers reaching for his throat. The ceiling, once high enough to be ignored, was now visibly lower, the dangling light bulb drifting closer to his forehead with every agonizing second. The air grew hotter, more compressed, making every movement feel like he was wading through a vat of thick, cooling wax. He tried to take a step toward the door, but the simple act of moving his foot caused a catastrophic reaction from the floorboards beneath him. As his weight shifted, the old timber let out a shrill, piercing creak that echoed through the room with the force of a thunderclap. The sound did not merely ring in his ears, it exploded in his brain, a white-hot spike of agony that made his vision blur and his knees buckle. Every subsequent sound, the rustle of his jacket, the thud of his own heart, the mechanical hum from outside, became a weapon, a sensory assault that felt like his nerves were being flayed by a razor. The motel was no longer a shelter, it was a torture chamber designed to amplify every vibration of his existence into a scream of pure, unadulterated pain. Thomas collapsed into a crouch, his hands covering his ears as he tried to shield himself from the auditory onslaught, but the hum from the earth was now a roar. It was the sound of 1,000 grinders, the friction of continental plates rubbing together, a mechanical apocalypse occurring just beneath the floorboards. He looked up at the ceiling and saw the plaster cracking, fine lines of white dust falling like snow onto the unmoving forms of Sarah and Liam. They remained as they were, puppets in a state of grace, seemingly immune to the pressure that was threatening to crush Thomas into a pulp. Their stillness was a reproach, a terrifying invitation to join them in their hollow, painless existence within the shadow of the lamp. Desperation drove him to crawl toward the window, his fingers clawing at the carpet as he dragged his heavy, leaden body across the floor. He needed to see the world outside, to confirm that the stars were still there, that the road still led back to the civilization they had left behind. He reached the heavy, greasy drapes and wrenched them aside with a final, desperate burst of strength. The metal rod shrieked in protest, the sound tearing through his mind like a serrated blade, but he did not close his eyes. He pressed his face against the cold glass, his breath fogging the surface in a frantic, irregular rhythm as he stared out into the night. Beyond the glass, there was no parking lot, no trees, and no horizon. There was only a wall of absolute, impenetrable obsidian, a darkness so thick and viscous that it seemed to have a physical weight. The light from the motel room did not illuminate the outside, it hit the window and stopped, dying at the threshold as if the glass were a portal into a vacuum. He could see his own reflection, a pale, distorted ghost with wide, terrified eyes, hovering over a void that refused to reflect a single photon of light. The darkness was not just an absence of light, it was a presence, a living thing that was waiting for the walls to finish their contraction so it could finally rush in. He remained there, pressed against the glass, a tiny spark of consciousness caught between the shrinking room and the encroaching void. The humming outside reached a fever pitch, a singular, vibrating note that seemed to be the sound of reality itself being torn apart at the seams. He felt the ceiling brush against the top of his head, the weight of the building beginning to bear down on his spine with a slow, merciless pressure. He looked back at the painting one last time, and through the shadows and the pain, he saw the three figures move. They were no longer standing at the edge of the light, they were turning, their featureless heads beginning to resolve into the terrifyingly familiar shapes of their own screaming faces. The sound did not begin in the ears, but rather deep within the marrow of the spine, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to harmonize with the rhythmic thudding of a heart pushed to its absolute limit. It was the unmistakable, droning hum of high-voltage wires, a sound of immense power struggling against its own containment, vibrating through the humid, stagnant air of the room. Beneath this electronic groan, a sharp, dry click echoed through the darkness, the sound of a heavy industrial switch being thrown, a mechanical snap that felt final and absolute. Thomas jolted upright, his muscles locking in a state of primal tension, the coarse sheets scratching against his sweat-slicked skin like the rasp of a file. The air in the room had become charged, tasting of ozone and the metallic tang of an impending storm, though the ceiling above remained a dark, unmoving slab of shadow. Every nerve in Thomas's body was screaming, his pulse a frantic, irregular hammering against the cage of his ribs, mimicking the frantic flutter of a bird trapped in a lightless box. He sat motionless for a heartbeat that felt like an hour, his eyes straining against the gloom of the room, which was no longer quite so dark as it should have been. A cold, jaundiced glow was beginning to bleed around the edges of the heavy, moth-eaten curtains, a light so intense it seemed to have physical weight. It was not the soft, diffused light of a rising sun or the distant sweep of a passing car, but a harsh, surgical illumination that felt intrusive and predatory. His breath came in shallow, jagged gasps, the sound of his own lungs scraping against the absolute silence of the motel's interior like sandpaper on bone. He knew, with a certainty that chilled the very blood in his veins, that the space beyond that window was supposed to be a void of empty fields and rotting grass. There were no street lamps at the Wanderer's Rest, no sources of artificial brilliance that could cast such long, aggressive shadows across the floorboards. The memory of the black road on the painting flashed through his mind, a vivid afterimage of oil and shadow that seemed to pulse in time with the electrical hum outside. The light seeped through the thin, fibrous weave of the drapes, turning the fabric into a glowing, translucent skin that highlighted every stray thread and every microscopic speck of dust dancing in the air. It was a sickly, unnatural yellow, the color of a bruised sky or a dying star, leaching the warmth out of the room and replacing it with a sterile, freezing clarity. Thomas slid his legs over the edge of the bed, the springs letting out a single, high-pitched shriek that felt like a needle being driven into the silence. His feet met the carpet, which felt unnaturally cold and damp, as if the moisture of the earth itself were beginning to rise through the floorboards. He stood with agonizing slowness, his knees popping with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the tomb-like stillness of the cabin. Each step toward the window was a battle against the leaden weight of his own terror, his toes curling into the threadbare fibers of the rug as he sought a purchase on a reality that was rapidly dissolving. The floor groaned beneath him, a series of dry, rhythmic complaints that followed his progress like the footsteps of an invisible stalker. His hand reached out, fingers trembling so violently that he could barely keep them extended, the pale skin of his arm appearing ghostly and drained of life in the encroaching yellow glow. The fabric of the curtain felt greasy and limp beneath his touch, a texture of neglect that made his skin crawl with a sudden, localized revulsion. He gripped the edge of the drape, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white as he hesitated, the electrical buzz outside rising to a fever pitch that made his teeth ache. The air near the glass was frigid, a pocket of winter trapped against the pane, smelling of ancient frost and the sharp, chemical scent of scorched insulation. With a sudden, jerky motion, he pulled the heavy fabric aside just enough to peer out into the night. The world on the other side of the glass was no longer the world he had fallen asleep in, but a monochrome nightmare rendered in shades of ash and ink. Directly in front of their door, rising from the cracked and weathered asphalt of the parking lot, stood a tall, skeletal street lamp that had not existed hours before. It was a monolithic spike of rusted iron, encrusted with jagged scales of corrosion that looked like dried, blackened blood under the mercury vapor glare. The lamp post leaned slightly toward the room, an architectural predator peering in, its glass housing cracked and clouded with the corpses of 1,000 incinerated moths. The light it cast was a violent, scouring yellow that obliterated the colors of the world, turning the surrounding landscape into a charcoal sketch where every shadow was a solid, unyielding wall. In the center of the illuminated circle, sitting perfectly still on the gravel that looked like crushed bone, was their silver sedan. The car appeared smaller, its metallic skin stripped of its familiar luster and replaced with a dull, matte gray that made it look as though it were made of carved lead. It sat at the exact angle depicted in the painting, its headlights dark and glassily vacant, like the eyes of a deep-sea creature brought to the surface and left to rot. The shadows beneath the vehicle were preternaturally dark, pooling on the ground like spilled oil, refusing to blend with the yellow light that hammered down from above. The car looked abandoned, a relic from a forgotten era, its tires appearing slightly flattened against the ground as if the very weight of the light were pressing it into the earth. Thomas felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, the perspective of the window and the perspective of the painting overlapping in a dizzying, nauseating blur. The lamp was precisely where the lamp had been on the canvas, its cold glow defining the boundaries of a reality that had been authored in oil and madness. He looked beyond the circle of light, but there was nothing to see, only a wall of absolute, impenetrable blackness that seemed to have no horizon and no end. The fields were gone, the distant highway was gone, and the stars had been extinguished as if they had never existed at all. There was only the lamp, the car, and the door to their room, caught in a tiny, illuminated bubble floating in a vacuum of infinite shadow. He turned back toward the room, his breath catching in a throat that had become as dry as sun-bleached wood, his eyes seeking the familiar shapes of his companions for comfort. The yellow light from the window cut a sharp, diagonal path across the room, illuminating the two beds that flanked his own with a brutal, unforgiving clarity. The sheets were pulled back, the fabric crumpled into a chaotic topography of folds and valleys that still held the shallow impressions of human bodies. Sarah's bed was a hollow of white linen, the pillow still showing the slight indentation where her head had rested, but the woman herself was nowhere to be seen. It was a negative space, a shape defined by what was no longer there, the emptiness of the bed feeling more profound than the presence of a corpse. Liam's bed was equally vacant, the heavy wool blanket slumped onto the floor in a heap that resembled a shed skin. Thomas moved toward it, his hand reaching out to touch the fabric, half expecting to find it still warm with the heat of a living man. Instead, the cloth was as cold as the glass of the window, smelling faintly of the same scorched rubber and damp earth that had permeated the motel since their arrival. There were no signs of a struggle, no discarded shoes or rumpled clothing left behind in a hurry. It was as if they had simply evaporated, filtered out of the room through the very pores of the wallpaper. The silence that filled the space where they should have been was a heavy, suffocating thing, a silence that had a physical weight and a cold, vibrating heart. Their belongings remained: a half-empty bottle of water on the nightstand, a crumpled map, a cell phone that sat dark and unresponsive on the dresser, but they looked like artifacts in a museum of a dead civilization. Thomas picked up the phone, his thumb pressing the power button with a desperate, rhythmic intensity, but the screen remained a void of black glass, reflecting nothing but his own gaunt, yellow-lit face. The device felt unnaturally light in his hand, a hollow shell of plastic and copper that had lost its purpose in this new, truncated world. He dropped it back onto the wood, the sound of the impact a dull, lifeless thud that did not echo, but was instead swallowed by the thick, dusty air of the room. He stood in the center of the floor, his head pivoting slowly as he scanned every corner of the room, his eyes wide and burning with the strain of searching for a hidden truth. The shadows in the corners seemed to be deepening, stretching toward him like the limbs of a patient, unfolding beast. The only sound was the incessant, electronic buzz of the lamp outside, a sound that had become a physical pressure, a constant grinding against the surface of his consciousness. It was the sound of a countdown, a hum that spoke of infinite patience and inevitable conclusion, a vibration that told him the light was not just illuminating him, but was also slowly dissolving him into the black and white landscape. His gaze fell finally upon the painting above the headboard, the one constant in the shifting nightmare of the motel. In the yellow light from the window, the canvas seemed to glow with an internal, malevolent brilliance, the thick strokes of black and gold appearing to move in the corner of his eye. He did not want to look at it, he wanted to scream and tear it from the wall, but his feet moved him closer with a mechanical, jerky motion that he could not control. The lamp on the canvas was now a perfect twin to the lamp outside, the light it cast on the painted wrote a mirror image of the light currently bleaching the colors from his own trembling hands. He was no longer a spectator looking at a scene, he was a character standing on the threshold of the frame, the boundary between the paint and the flesh becoming a thin, transparent veil. The silence within the room was now so total that he could hear the sound of his own blood rushing through his carotid artery, a frantic, swishing noise like the sea in a distant shell. It was a tomb-like stillness that felt final, as if the room had been sealed in lead and buried beneath miles of silent, airless earth. There were no more shuffling sounds behind the walls, no more dripping faucets, only the singular, monolithic hum of the lamp. He felt a sudden, terrifying sense of isolation, a realization that he was the last point of consciousness in a universe that was being systematically erased and replaced with a static, unmoving image. The cold from the window was spreading, numbing his fingers and toes, turning his limbs into heavy, uncooperative pillars of stone. He looked back at the window, at the silver car and the rusted iron pole, and for a fleeting, horrifying second, he thought he saw a movement in the shadows just beyond the circle of light. It was a shifting of the blackness, a slow, deliberate unfurling of something that possessed no form and no face, yet moved with a purposeful, predatory grace. The hum of the wires intensified, a crescendo of electronic agony that made the glass in the window begin to vibrate in its frame. Thomas stood paralyzed, his fingers digging into the soft, rotting wood of the dresser, his eyes fixed on the door that separated him from the light outside. He was alone in the yellow glow, a single silhouette waiting for the click of the switch that would finally plunge his world into the absolute, unyielding black of the road. The cold, jaundiced light from the street lamp outside continued to pour through the window, but its brilliance was no longer a mere illumination, it had become a corrosive force that stripped away the shadows of the room until every peeling strip of wallpaper stood out with a terrifying, razor-sharp clarity. Thomas turned his head toward the wall above the bed with the agonizing slowness of a man moving through deep, freezing water. His neck muscles felt stiff and fibrous, as if the very tendons were being replaced by strands of dry hemp. The air in the room had grown impossibly thick, carrying a heavy, cloying scent of fresh linseed oil, oxidized turpentine, and a metallic undertone of raw, wet earth. Every inch of his skin crawled with a frantic, pins and needles sensation, 1,000 invisible needles pricking at his pores as he finally forced his gaze to meet the heavy wooden frame. The canvas was no longer the dry, ancient relic that had greeted them on their arrival, it had undergone a grotesque and liquid rebirth. In the shivering yellow light, the surface of the painting glistened with a sickening, viscous moisture, the thick strokes of black oil paint appearing to melt and run down the fabric. Long, dark beads of paint, the color of a midnight sea, were gathering at the bottom edge of the frame, swelling like heavy droplets of blood before they began to slide down the dark wood in slow, agonizing tracks. They looked like thick, oily tears shed by the house itself, leaving shimmering trails of obsidian that caught the light with a predatory glint. The smell of the wet paint was now overwhelming, a suffocating chemical cloud that seemed to be drawing the very oxygen out of his lungs. Within the frame, the nightmare had reached its horrific culmination, a silent theater of suffering rendered in agonizing detail. Under the pale glow of the painted street lamp, the figures of Sarah and Liam were no longer just static silhouettes, they were portraits of pure, unadulterated terror. Their bodies were pressed tightly together, their features distorted into wide, gaping maws of a scream that produced no sound, their eyes stretched into hollow, terrified circles of white. Their hands were splayed flat against the surface of the painting, their fingers spread wide as if they were pushing with all their might against a sheet of cold, invisible glass that separated their world from his. Thomas could see the microscopic indentations where their phantom fingertips met the barrier, the texture of the paint swirling around their desperate grips like water around a drowning man. The third space beneath the lamp, the spot on the shoulder of the black road where the silver sedan was parked, remained a yawning, expectant void. It was a pool of jaundiced yellow that seemed to pulsate with a rhythmic, magnetic pull, a vacancy that felt more solid and real than the bed beneath him. The emptiness of that spot was a physical ache, an invitation into a world where time was a frozen, two-dimensional trap. He could see the texture of the gravel in that empty space, each tiny stone painted with a singular, focused malice, waiting for a third set of footprints to mar its perfection. The silence emanating from the canvas was a roar of negation, a vacuum that was slowly pulling the air from the room and into the light of the black road. At that moment, the hum of the high-voltage wires from the lamp outside shifted, the low-frequency drone sharpening into a piercing, ultrasonic whistle that vibrated through the very bones of Thomas's skull. The sound was no longer a noise but a physical assault, a thin, silver needle of sound that pierced his eardrums and made his vision blur into a chaotic mess of yellow and black. The whistle intensified until it felt as though the air itself were being shredded, a high-pitched scream of reality being stretched beyond its breaking point. Thomas tried to raise his hands to cover his ears, but his limbs refused to obey, his nervous system seemingly disconnected from the physical shell of his body. The sound was a command, a signal of the final collapse, a sonic vibration that was vibrating his atoms into a new and terrifying alignment. His legs began to fail him first, a sudden and total weight of lead settling into his thighs and calves, pinning him to the spot like a statue. He looked down, his heart thudding with a heavy, wet rhythm, and saw that the fabric of his trousers was losing its softness, the cloth becoming stiff and rigid as it melded with his flesh. The carpet beneath his feet seemed to be rising, or perhaps he was sinking, the boundaries between the floor and his soles becoming a single, seamless surface of gray and brown. The sensation of weight was absolute, a gravitational pull that originated not from the earth, but from the wall where the painting hung. He was becoming an anchor, a fixed point in a room that was beginning to lose its three-dimensional depth. Thomas raised his hands to his face, and a fresh wave of horror washed over him as he watched his own skin begin to transform. The pale, trembling flesh of his fingers was darkening, the pores closing up and being replaced by the coarse, rhythmic weave of a heavy canvas. The subtle lines of his palms were deepening, turning into the sharp, jagged cracks of craquelure that one might see on an 18th-century portrait. His veins, once a vibrant, pulsing blue, were darkening into thick, obsidian ridges of oil paint, the blood within them turning into a cold, slow-moving sludge of black pigment. He could feel the texture of himself changing, the warmth of his body being replaced by the sterile, brittle coldness of a finished artwork. He opened his mouth to scream, to call out for help or even just to hear the sound of his own voice one last time, but his vocal cords had turned to dry, frayed twine. Instead of a cry, a thin, papery rustle escaped his throat, the sound of dry leaves being crushed under a heavy boot or the rubbing of two sheets of sandpaper together. The air he exhaled was no longer a warm mist but a puff of fine, gray dust that hung suspended in the yellow light before settling onto the front of his jacket. His jaw felt locked, the hinges of his bones turning into solid, unyielding wood, his face becoming a mask of frozen, silent agony that mirrored the faces of the friends who had already been claimed. The room around him began to undergo a final, catastrophic distortion, the walls leaning inward with a slow, geometric precision that defied the laws of physics. The ceiling dropped lower and lower, the jaundiced light bulb now just inches from his head, its heat no longer burning but feeling like the dry, artificial warmth of a gallery spotlight. The corners of the room were vanishing, the distance between the door and the window shrinking as the three-dimensional space was compressed into a singular, flat plane. Thomas felt the volume of his own body being sucked out of him, his chest flattening, his shoulders widening, his entire being stretched and pressed into a sheet of fibrous, painted existence. The world was becoming a frame, a rectangular boundary that was the only reality left. Through the thinning veil of his consciousness, he heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps approaching from the corridor outside his room. The sound was muffled and distant, as if coming through a thick layer of felt, but it possessed a terrifying, purposeful weight. He heard the metallic scrape of a key in the lock, the sound echoing with a hollow, echoing clunk that felt like the closing of a tomb. The door groaned open, and a shadow fell across the room, the tall, hunched shape of the motel owner, silhouetted against the dark hallway. The old man entered with a slow, deliberate shuffle, the smell of damp earth and formalin following him like a shroud, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards that were no longer quite solid. Thomas watched through eyes that were now nothing more than beads of black glass as the owner approached the wall above the bed. The old man's breath was a wet, rattling sound, a rhythmic wheeze of a long-dead accordion, as he stood before the painting. He reached out with a gnarled, paint-stained hand, his fingers tracing the edges of the heavy wooden frame with a terrifying, paternal tenderness. He made a low, satisfied sound in his throat, a grunt of contentment, a dry, guttural crack that signaled the end of a long and difficult labor. He gripped the sides of the frame and gave it a small, sharp tug, adjusting its angle until it hung perfectly straight against the jaundiced wallpaper, centered with the precision of a master curator. The owner's shadow lingered for a moment longer, a dark stain on the world of paint and canvas, before he turned and shuffled out of the room, the sound of his departure fading into the distance. The click of the door closing was the final sound Thomas heard, a sharp, surgical punctuation mark that severed his connection to the world of light and air. The room was now empty of life, a silent chamber filled with the scent of drying oil and the cold, unyielding light of the lamp. Within the frame, the three figures stood together on the black road, Thomas, Sarah, and Liam, their bodies frozen in a triangle of shadow, their faces forever locked in a silent, screaming plea beneath the yellow glow of the lonely street lamp. The next morning, the sun did not rise over the wanderer's rest. Instead, the gray mist simply grew a fraction lighter, revealing a landscape that had been purged of all detail. In room number 12, the painting above the headboard was complete, a masterpiece of shadow and light that depicted three friends standing by their silver sedan on a road that led nowhere. The paint had finally dried, the cracks in the oil creating a web of fine, silver lines that made the figures appear ancient, as if they had always belonged to the canvas. The room was pristine, the beds made with military precision, the dust settled into a uniform, undisturbed layer that covered every surface like a fresh fall of ash. Outside, the parking lot was a vast, unbroken expanse of gray gravel, as flat and featureless as a desert of crushed bone. There was no sign of the silver sedan, no tire tracks in the loose stones, and no footprints leading to or from the room. In the exact spot where the car had stood the night before, a single, lonely clump of dry, yellowed grass poked through a crack in the old, weathered asphalt. It shivered in a wind that made no sound, a tiny, organic blemish on a world that had been rendered perfectly, chillingly static. The neon sign of the motel flickered once, twice, and then went dark, leaving the wanderer's rest to fade back into the silent, ink-black void from which it had emerged.